Illinois courts weighed in on two high-profile legal battles. We'll talk about it next on Capitol View. Welcome to Capitol View, the show where we talk about Illinois politics and government. I'm your host, Jamey Dunn with Illinois Issues and NPR Illinois. And joining us today is Jordan Abudayyeh with News Channel 20. Jordan, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
And Bruce Ruston with the Illinois Times. Bruce, glad you're here.
I'm glad to be here.
So we've got a lot of kind of trickle of news to cover today. I want to talk first about a couple of lawsuits that have been going through the courts. Let's start with the redistricting lawsuit. The Illinois Supreme Court shot down an amendment that folks were trying to get on the ballot to change the way the state draws its legislative districts. Jordan, tell us a little bit about this. This is the second time that this group, or at least a similar group, has tried to do this. What's going on?
Yeah, they called themselves the Independent Map Group. They wanted to change the Constitution. They wanted to create a panel that would create the legislative districts instead of leaving it to lawmakers like we currently do. And they have a popular point. They got more than 500,000 signatures across the state of Illinois, and it's a very popular idea to say, I want to have a say in how these maps are drawn versus letting the lawmakers who we're supposed to be electing draw their own districts. Why would we let them do that? Of course they're going to be gerrymandered, and that's why we have incumbents who don't have challengers, and we have, elections where it's very hard to beat incumbents and that sort of thing. And so they have a popular point, and they gathered a lot of signatures, but the state Supreme Court said no. This is the second time they told them no. Some people have said that their amendment went too far, it was too complicated, and so will they try again? Probably. This doesn't seem to be an issue that's going away, but they are asking the state Supreme Court. They petitioned earlier this week to ask them to rehear the case, that they didn't consider some things, especially the debate from the 1970s convention, and so they want the case to be reheard, and so that's kind of their last Hail Mary.
Well, and Bruce, the governor is, of course, making a lot of hay of this. He's saying it's one of his top priorities to get this change done. This is just a highly political topic, no matter where you slice it.
Yes, and it was a one-vote margin here on the Supreme Court. This is a torn Supreme Court. This isn't like stuff we've seen before on stuff like pensions, for example, where it was fairly clear what was going to happen. This was a court that seemed torn, and it's a very strange, shaped up a very strange political season. Who would have guessed that so many reporters would have come out to see Pat Quinn now say, hey, I've got an alternative here. And what Quinn's alternative here that he's presenting as a way to get around the Supreme Court's indigestion with this is that the Supreme Court was saying we're going to hand the power to create this non-political, non-partisan commission to the Auditor General. Well, that then creates a duty that is not engendered in the Constitution, and you can't do that according to the Supreme Court. You're basically changing the duties of an officer. And so Quinn's would put this in the hands of the Supreme Court itself, as I understand this, which is kind of a tough. Do you guys not want to do this? So, and the Supreme Court, there are a lot of folks out there who will tell you, and there's some evidence to it, that it's not about politics in some instances either. I don't know whether that's the case here, but if you put the Supreme Court in charge of picking the commission, that comes with its own set of issues too. But clearly there's a lot of folks who would rather see that happen than what we've seen in the past, which is the status quo, the legislature doing it.
And the problem here, Jordan, is that the citizens initiative provision in the Constitution, it's really narrow, right? Like, it's not like California where we can just kind of put anything on the ballot and try to move it forward.
It is. It's incredibly narrow. You can only change that legislative article of the Constitution. And so that's kind of what Quinn's argument was. And he's the only person that's ever been successful in that effort. He led the effort. And so he said, I understand the parameters, and this is why my proposal is better than the last one. And so, yeah, it's not easy in the state of Illinois to get something on the ballot so that the voters actually have a say. And so this is going to be an issue I think we're going to see for a long time. When I spoke with Governor Rauner this week, he said that redistricting reform is now his #1 priority. And so that to me is interesting because we're going to come back after this election and they have pension reform, another budget to handle on top of his pro-business reforms, and now redistricting reform is going to be the #1 priority for you, despite the fact that it's not going to have an impact for years to come.
Yeah, so. I think you tried to walk that back a little bit. I said that's going to be a #1 priority along with a lot of other stuff too.
Right.
So. Many #1 priorities. priorities. And yeah, a lot of folks may be questioning that when we're seeing the state with only a 6-month budget right now. I think, the budget is a top priority for a lot of folks.
Right, versus
as well.
something that's not going to happen and for, more years to come. He could make the argument that it's kicking the can down the road and, we can't wait until a few years from now when, the census is done again and this process starts again. And so this is a popular issue for him, and would we be having this argument if Republicans had drawn the map? That's a worthwhile question, but it's a popular argument, and so of course he's going to make it right now.
Well, I think it would be the politics of it, or at least potentially interesting, depending on how far Pat Quinn gets with his. I mean, if it ends up with Pat Quinn and Bruce Rauner agreeing on an issue and moving it forward, wouldn't that be great? I mean, to see Bruce Rauner give campaign money to Pat Quinn to make this happen, I mean, that would be.
But so far, the governor kind of dismissed Quinn's effort at least a little bit, and said, that wasn't maybe the way to go. But
well, which you would expect, but something's better than nothing. I mean, something's better. I would argue in the mind of the governor, something is better. I mean, if we're arguing about whether it's the Supreme Court versus Mike Madigan, I think we know which way the governor would go.
Well, and to be fair, of course, a highly political issue, everything's politicized in Illinois, but there is a core group of kind of good government folks who've been pushing for this for a long time. League of Women Voters has been on this issue. There are some people who really just want to see this happen because they think it's the right thing to do, right?
Well, yeah, but there's a lot of things that folks have pushed for because I think it's the right thing to do. They've never really seemed to born fruition here in Illinois. I mean, automatic, moving right along, automatic voter registration. A lot of folks think that's the right thing to do. I mean, that is a measure that got bipartisan support. It's going on in 5 states now in the United States. It's relatively new. This is the one where you go and you have some kind of interaction with government, typically by getting a driver's license, and you are automatically enrolled to vote unless you say, no, I don't want to do that. And you also have to attest that I am legally allowed to vote. For example, non-citizens can get driver's licenses, but they're not allowed to vote. And so at any rate, this is being billed as a way to increase participation in elections. It's been adopted, I think Oregon was the first state. There's 4 others, I think, that have fallen in line with this. It's gotten really popular. The legislature passed it in Illinois, with support on both sides of the aisle. And here now is Rauner saying no, vetoing it. And so that's just because an idea is popular in Illinois doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to reach fruition.
And the governor's saying he agrees in theory, but he just doesn't like this.
It's the details. I really like apple pie, but there's the recipe for it that I disagree with.
So I want to move on to another court case that's come down over the past couple days. Social service providers in the state were suing because they had been waiting for months and months to get payments, some of them still waiting, of course, from the time that the state didn't have any budget to speak of for social service providers. We did have a K-12 budget. A judge threw out that case. Jordan, what happened there? Something in the contract that says subject to appropriation?
Right, everything in the state of Illinois is subject to appropriation, and so I think that just proves how hard it is going to be for these social service agencies to come back and fight for what they believe is theirs. And they all struggled for about a year during this impasse, and so I think a lot of people looked at that, and the court can always go one way or another, but were they really going to get paid? Probably not. Where was that money going to come from? It's not like the state is just swimming in cash at the moment. The people who have appropriations are still waiting for money, and so while this would have maybe given them some comfort to know that they were going to be paid eventually, even if they had won this case, they wouldn't have seen money for a while, and it would have compounded the state's problems. So it's interesting that they didn't make it, but is it surprising? No.
And there are those groups saying they're definitely considering an appeal. But Bruce, these are services that these groups have already administered under contract with the state. Have we ever seen anything like this before? I mean, this is like uncharted waters.
Yeah, we're in a lot of uncharted waters here. I mean, and this is one of them. When you look. To some extent, this is a buyer beware thing on it. Forget about the legal side of it for a second. These agencies have known for a long time that the payment from the state of Illinois can be delayed. It's never been delayed to the extent it has now. But
sometimes waiting 3, 4, 6 months to get paid.
3, 4, 6. I mean, now you got folks. I mean, some folks from the fair I don't think got paid, and this is different from social services. People have been waiting a year, and sometimes to get paid. And so you kind of know that that's what you're signed up for, and it is, of course, subject to appropriations. And so legalistically, yeah, I mean, I don't think they had a very good shot at it. But it is something. If you there are a few places, I think that locally there's a hardware store, Noonan's Hardware, that at some point said, we're not doing business with the state of Illinois because it takes too long to get paid. Well, that's a hardware store versus social service agencies, and I think folks would probably argue that, services for social services are sometimes more important than, say, renting a tent from a hardware store. Nonetheless, at least in theory, they have the option of saying, we don't have to do this, we can, but that's also just in theory, because there's real people here too.
Well,
I do think it's interesting too, though, to look at, the way that the state has the social safety net built, that, they have partnerships with these people. And if you're not going to honor those partnerships, and they're going to provide services and programs for some of the, lowest in our state, those who need help the most, then where does that go from here? What are we doing to the social safety net in our state? What are we doing to these programs that usually have very good outcomes, that help people, help them grow? And so I think that's a question worth asking. If these people can't trust that they're going to provide services and be paid, or that they're going to enter into a contract and it's not really worth anything at the state, what does that do to our entire social safety network? And I think that's one of the questions that came out of this.
Because the state doesn't have an alternative. It's not like the state has this infrastructure, has this staff itself.
And the agencies, in fact, don't really have a real alternative either. If not for the support from the state, a lot of them wouldn't be in business. So now they have support from the state with fingers crossed. It's an IOU support.
Well, while we're on the topic of social services and funding, Jordan, I want to talk to you a little bit about, you mentioned that you went to an event today, as we're filming on Thursday, that was a funeral for the state of Illinois. Can you just tell us a little bit about what that was? We've seen a lot of these kind of groups trying to push back and protest and make some noise about what's going on.
We've seen a lot of rallies and a lot of marches. This one was a little bit more interesting in terms of, it was leaders of various faith communities coming together from all over the state in front of the governor's mansion with a hearse and a casket, and really an old-fashioned funeral procession. They were, marching around the governor's mansion, and they say that this is the death of Illinois. This is the death of programs and services that people rely on, and they were mourning that death. There was one bright spot. They did say that, with help from God and, working together and compromise, that the state could be saved. They were hoping for that. There was a lot of prayer for that, and maybe that's what the state needs. Maybe we're at that point. We need a higher power. But they were people, and they were mostly minorities. And I think the thing that was interesting about it is we saw Governor Rauner campaigning in black churches. We saw him visiting them soon after he was elected. There was a pastor from the Springfield church where he was at the 2 weeks after he was inaugurated, and I said, you were supporting him then. Do you feel like he's abandoned the minority community? And they really do feel that way. I mean, these are faith leaders in minority communities who are coming together and saying the governor had promised us change. He had promised that he would continue to fund things that were important to us, and that's not really happening anymore.
Well, and as the governor and lawmakers are trying to put together the budget for next fiscal year, which seems like a long way off right now, given that this fiscal year isn't quite sorted out, there will likely be less money to go around because the Teachers Retirement System Board took a vote at the end of last week that will basically require that the state pay more into that system for public school teachers and retired teachers in the state. Bruce, what happened with this vote, and why does the governor maybe not like what's going on so much here?
The Teachers Retirement System has just voted to lower its expected rate of return on its investments, I believe, from 7.5% to 7%. And what that means is that the state then has to increase its contribution, its annual contribution to the retirement system to keep it afloat.
And that rate of return, basically trying to guess how much it'll make up.
Exactly. And if you look at the last 8-10 years or so, folks aren't getting 7% or even 7% now. There's an argument out there that 5% is actually a more realistic figure. So 7% is even probably higher than what might be realistic. But what that does is that then blows a $500 million hole in the state budget, because the state, which already can't balance its budget, we're $8 billion owing on bills. I can't, every day you look, but so the state already has huge fiscal issues. Now they've got another $500 million hole handed to them, and Rauner is like, no, don't do this, please don't do this. And he already, I believe, had 2 or 3 members on the board that were appointed by him, and he had another 2 or 3 that joined the board just at the last minute but weren't eligible to vote. But even the folks who he had appointed to the board voted in favor increasing or lowering the annual expectation, which blows the hole in the budget. And if you think back to Rauner, the candidate, that's probably exactly what he would have argued for, because this is really fiscal responsibility. This is tough love. This is saying, there's obligations we have that have to be met before we can do anything else. And that's really what the pension system really and truly amounts to. And that's why Moody's applauded this. The rating agency said, "Good job, TRS. That's exactly what you should do." And so, it kind of puts the governor a bit in a bind now too. Is it okay? Now you were against doing this, and now what are you gonna say to Wall Street? Because Wall Street now says they did the right thing, and you're in some way, shape, and form a creature of Wall Street yourself.
And if you listen to the debate that happened while that board was making that decision, they heard a presentation from the actuaries, they listened, but the head of the fund really said, our job is not to worry about what the state of Illinois has and their budget. Our job is to make sure that this pension fund remains healthy, and we need to do what we need to do to make sure this fund is healthy. And so it's a tough spot to be in, because I think everybody knows that the state is so broke, and where's that money going to come from? But in the end, this pension fund's got to be there for the people who have retired from the state of Illinois, and so they did what they had to do.
Yeah, and and I got to say that this is almost, if you think back historically here, TRS was a real big piece of the puzzle in the Blagojevich scandals. They were the ones that were doing things at the behest of the governor or the governor's men or people to try to sway votes certain ways. It's not happening anymore. It certainly didn't. Blagojevich and his minions were able to manipulate that board years ago. That certainly didn't happen this time around.
Like swing contracts and investments.
Exactly. Who gets money for investments? And so, if Rauner has some secret strings to pull, it didn't work this time.
Well, and while Moody's did applaud this move, Jordan, they also have had some concerns to bring forth about the state budget. Nothing real surprising, but what are they saying as far as how things are going with the budget?
Yeah,
and the backlog.
A lack thereof. I mean, we can call what we have right now a budget, but I think nobody's fooled by that. The bill backlog is continuing to grow. There was an estimate that it could reach $14 billion by next year, and so we're not paying that off. We're not growing revenue. The state's not doing anything to handle it. I mean, they essentially just kicked the can down the road when lawmakers skipped town and said, hey, we have an election to worry about. And so, yeah, I mean, everyone's taking notice. I don't think you're going to fool the investor services who are looking at this and going, oh, well, they didn't do anything to accomplish that. I mean, let's not forget that budget relies on court orders and consent decrees continuing. And so we're still spending money we don't have, despite the fact that we have some appropriations in place. So I don't think you can call it a budget, and I don't think it's fooling anybody else.
Well, and moving on from the budget, but don't worry, we'll be back to it, I'm sure, every show from here on out. The State Board of Elections voter registration website was hacked a while back, and now some of the numbers and what's going on with that have been coming out. Bruce, what are we seeing here? It looks like lots of folks' information may have gotten out.
I think the number that the board put out, I mean, this had been first arose, I think, in July. There were some media reports that there had been some sort of intrusion, and now the Board of Elections formally confirmed, yep, it happened, and here's some numbers to go along with that. And they are saying at this point in time, in the area, I think, of 3,100 folks had their information viewed. Now, they're very apt. The board says no worries in terms of having things manipulated. There was nothing that was changed there, however, stuff was looked at. And we know that a certain other number, I think, were looked at, but we don't know which ones they were. But don't worry, nothing's been, nothing.
No one added, no one
subtracted. Yeah. It was just kind of, we took a look-see and stuff like presumably where you might live, I think, and personal information that should remain in a private database. Who that was and why exactly they would do that, who knows? I mean, because you've got that this has happened in other states. This is being billed as perhaps part of a larger trend, and not to have a tinfoil hat on, are the Ruskies behind this? I mean, is this Trump? Is this, is there some, and it just gets curiouser and curiouser. And if the Board of Elections can be, if what they're telling us is accurate, then we probably have nothing to worry about. But it doesn't have a very good feeling when you're looking here and seeing like that these intrusions could happen on any level whatsoever. The FBI is investigating.
Of course, I mean, we know there's lots of folks out there that are just constantly testing these large databases to try to get information to find weaknesses for, say, credit scams or those kinds of things.
Or even
as
to
well.
get rewards. I mean, I don't know whether the Board of Elections pays a bounty if you find a backdoor into their information, similar to like what some software companies pay. But yeah, I mean, and you can see why you would want to do this. I mean, you know, if you can get to the Board of Elections website, there were some reports that folks showed up in some place. I'm not sure if it was Illinois or outside to vote, and they said, "Oh, you're not a Republican, you're a Democrat." In other words, they switched the ballot, you know. And so I don't believe that happened in Illinois, but there are reports of this happening elsewhere. So that's a sort of hanky-panky that at least conceivably could happen.
Well, and Jordan, this kind of bolsters the argument that's been made for a while, and that the governor's making now, that the state needs to invest in its tech infrastructure maybe a little more than it is.
Yeah, I mean, there were reports that it was not hard to hack, you know,
Yes.
the State Board of Elections.
Child's play was the
Yeah, and so, you know, that's kind of scary. And I think at this point, you know, the public, the general public, we're so used to data breaches now, and it's usually to steal your information so someone can go like buy a house on your credit card number or something. So I think for a lot of people, when they hear that stuff was breached, they're not worried that they're not going to be able to vote. I think they're more worried about like who has my information and what are they doing with it. And so, yeah, the fact that it was not hard to get into the system proves that there might need to be some adjustments made and maybe some improvements. And so,
yeah, you wouldn't be able to buy anything with that data except for perhaps an election, which is, you know, as opposed to with a credit card.
So the governor has kind of alluded over the last few months to the possibility of AFSCME, the largest public employee workers union, striking in the near future, and he actually had said September 1st was the maybe rumored strike date. Bruce, he didn't give any real concrete evidence as to why this was the case. We've seen it come now, no strike.
It's kind of like, okay, the Armageddon day was, we're still all here. And the governor had alluded to this, I believe, sometime last summer in July, and never said with, well, you know, distance himself so you can't, I think, say, well, you know, it's been told to me, and there's talk about, you know, there's not like so-and-so directly told me this on such and such a date. So it's been so September 1st has come and gone. And I don't know that anybody really took it overly seriously. I mean, if there had been a strike date planned, you would think that would have gotten out. I don't know that AFSCME has even taken a strike vote of any way, shape, or form at this point in time.
But there's a lot of conflict going on, Jordan. I mean, there's reasons why people are wondering what's going to happen, and that there are rumblings and rumors as far as what could happen in the future.
This fight between AFSCME and the Rauner administration has gotten ugly in the weirdest ways sometimes. It feels like sometimes that the administration is leaking certain things to the media or saying things to the media that they know AFSCME is going to hear in the media, and vice versa, and it's just a lot of it's playing out in the media in editorials or documents that are coming out, or, you know, we saw the administration making a video and posting it to the website as a question and answer for union employees who are working for the state of Illinois, and then we saw, you know, AFSCME was handing out a questionnaire to some of their members just to see where they were at. And so it's not like that there's nothing happening behind the scenes, but I think a lot of it is being exaggerated in the media, which is sad to say. But, you know, everyone's wondering what's going to happen next with this fight. And so anytime one little thing comes out, everybody jumps on it. But, you know, the September 1st date, I think, was one of those things like, let me just throw this out there and see how this plays. And so, yeah, I don't think that there probably wasn't a set firm date of September 1st, but I mean, in November, we're expected to get some sort of resolution from the labor board, and then there's appeals processes, and the legal process has to play out, and there, you know, so it's not over, but I think maybe some people would wish it was over at this point.
The big question is there any kind of negotiation that's going on at any level between these two groups? And so far, there's no indication that's. There isn't. And so it's just it's kind of like the next big day now is November 4th, just kind of like it is with the budget. Everything, you know, we're almost like on this. It feels like almost on this pause. Well, on those two big major issues, while we decide who we want our leaders to be to lead us out of this. So.
Well, there'd be very little motivation for the union to strike before these decisions have come down, right? Like, there's not a lot of upside.
They've been doing well. I mean, they won the first round, as I recall. I mean, in terms of convincing a judge that perhaps they're not really at an impasse. And so, no, I can't understand why the union would ever You know, I mean, perhaps if there were unilateral conditions imposed that really were a drastic cut to their health care benefits, but it would have to be pretty drastic. I mean, the union doesn't have a strike fund. The union, I think, is just, you know, trying to hold on to what it's got as opposed to trying to reach for something more. And so I think the union, you know, they're not happy with it, but the status quo, I think, is way better than being out on strike. I have a hard time seeing them doing it.
Well, we've been talking about a lot of election-related issues. So, Bruce, I want to get a little update or chat with you a little bit about this same-day voter registration lawsuit that is going on. Some folks out there are challenging. I believe is it the Illinois Policy Institute challenging?
It's some conservative interest, and so forgive me, I'm not up to speed as much as I should be.
Challenging the concept of voters being able to register the day of the election. There's some question over whether larger counties and smaller counties can do something different.
You can vote, you can register on the same day of the election in all 102 counties. The difference is that the law says is that in counties with population of 100,000 or more, you can register any polling place, and so it's more convenient. So if I live in one of these smaller rural counties, I can't just go to my local schoolhouse or wherever it is I usually cast my ballot. I've got to go, typically I would guess, to the county seat in order to register, and so it's less convenient for folks. And so it's being challenged on equal protection grounds that just because I live in a county with a smaller population, I should have the equal access to registration as folks who live in the larger counties. That's the basis of the lawsuit, and that was filed in early August. I mean, that could mean some things. I mean, if this is tossed out, that would presumably hurt Democrats and certainly help Republicans. And there's some tight races, I think, particularly in some of these collar counties, where that might be seen as a pretty important issue.
So it could make a big difference if this is decided. Presumably would be decided before the election, probably.
You got to wonder whether they timed that lawsuit, the filing, if that had anything to do with it. But yeah, I mean, it was filed, I believe, the first week of August. It would go to the trial court, and presumably it could be appealed. And I can't imagine the Supreme Court would take it, you know, in time for the election, or even an appellate court. So it'll be an interesting thing to follow. It's one of these things that hasn't probably gotten as much publicity as some of these other court cases, or not necessarily court cases, but, you know, automatic voter registration, that's gotten a lot more publicity than this. But this could actually be a pretty big issue coming up to Election Day.
And we'll have to leave it at that for this week. I'd like to thank my guests, Jordan and Bruce, and I'm your host, Jamey Dunn with Illinois Issues, and we'll see you next week on Capitol View.